Wow, guys. So South Africa has actually joined the OECD countries to actually implement a 15% corporate tax on multinational companies operating within the nation. All right. So according to the OECD, 80% of global tax revenue is actually produced by 20% of the companies in the world. All right, so we still see that whole 80% principle. If you are part of those people who understand entrepreneurship and these principles of productivity. So the OECD actually gave a directive for multinational companies operating in, other parts of the world to pay a minimum of 15% tax. All right. So there have been structures in these companies that have actually made these companies be able to somehow pay taxes lower than 15%. All right. So the OECD actually is trying to really make it sort of like fair so that the companies around the world, multinational companies, are able to pay at least 15% of the tax, corporate tax, so to speak, in the nation, the country where they operate. All right. And we know that South Africa's corporate tax is already even higher than that. Corporate tax in South Africa, I think it's argued to be 27% thereabout, all right? So it's even higher already than it says South Africa's corporate tax actually stands at 27%. So it's actually already higher than the OECD standard, all right? So naturally, this, I think in my own analysis anyway, should not be a problem, okay? So multinationals operating in South Africa who have their headquarters in South Africa should now pay a minimum of 15% tax, especially those that have been paying less than that before. And this is actually what might cause the shock, because if these multinational companies in South Africa who actually also try to really adhere to the BEE policies of the ANC government, or now the GNU, and other sort of like what the likes of Gerhard Papenfuss called red taping, all right, of entrepreneurship and companies in South Africa, then this increase in tax, if they were paying lower, if they now have to pay more taxes to the tune of 15%, is actually sort of like might expose them to kind of like shocks in ways that probably they might decide to end their companies of really pack shop, and we see much more threat on the unemployment crisis in South Africa going forward. So there are some really interesting comments I saw of South Africans really reacting to this news, and for me this is much more a reflection of South Africa. Most times when I really see these reports on the news, I actually feel that the comment in itself, the comments are actually the education, because this is actually what South Africans actually have in mind. And when they speak, when they give comments like that, you are able to read the tensions of the country going forward. So many South Africans really were angry with this fact that President Ramaphosa decided to implement this 15% tax on multinational companies in a country that already seems like, the whole business environment is not really so friendly. And many of them actually argued that this 15% tax might not make the country investment friendly and all of that. So these are some of the comments some South Africans actually had regarding this 15% increase in the tax for multinational companies in South Africa. This guy here says, yes, so the increased tax rate will create upward pressure on prices, which will be absorbed by the consumer. And these companies will now be searching for other countries to establish themselves. So this is actually a really interesting analysis, because the fact that these companies now will not have to pay more taxes, in probably if their headquarters are in South Africa, would mean that they would have to increase the price of their products, which at the end of the day, the consumer then ends up having to bear that burden. And this consumer we speak about is actually probably a SASSA recipient, or an unemployed South African, or one of the people who in the charts I've shared on this channel are those who have lost hope that they would ever find a job in South Africa. They now have to bear this burden of higher prices, and only God knows how that whole thing would actually affect this whole problem. This other guy says, our country is on its way down fast. This other one says, chase even more investment away. This other one says, I'm still fascinated by the idea that individuals that earn less than $1 million pay 45% in tax, while businesses make millions. While businesses making millions are paying 15%. So this person understand the whole, principle of corporate tax and all of that. But these are kind of things that, many of us should be really getting educated on, and to really understand the importance of starting businesses, because businesses are actually the key. The society rewards you for starting a business than being a dependent on the economy or getting a job or salary or even SASA. All right. So this is actually why I try to bring up these issues so that we can discuss on Kwazemi here and really try to really inspire people to now start seeing business and wealth creation as more important than being a dependent in South Africa. This other guy says, you must attract multinationals to create jobs, not scare them away. This other one says, can our present president tell us if he pays taxes? This other one says, this is stupidity. We want multinational businesses in South Africa. We need 20 million jobs. Cut the tax to 8% and abolish BBBEEE. And we will be the world's richest, most lucrative country in the world with 100% employment. We will build the world's strongest economy and the world's strongest country. So if I own Microsoft and Ireland charges 9% multinational business tax and South Africa needs 15%, where am I going to take my business? To the country where I pay 6% less. So this is actually the logic, and I think this is what the OECD thought about when they tried to really level the playing field, that all these multinationals should actually enforce a 15% global tax rate, so to speak. So if all the countries now, kind of like implement this 15%, I think in my analysis that most of the countries would now want to shift, especially those ones who actually have been paying less than 15%, would now want to move to countries where there's much more efficiency to now generate the income to produce that 15%. But in a country like South Africa now, where we see a 33.5% increase, unemployment rate, we see that as much as 33,000 residents in South Africa, taxpayers, active taxpayers, have changed their residency. All right, we see that there's a really heavy dependent to the tune of 24 or 25 million South Africans, who are dependent on SASA. We also see that South Africa is a country that has as much as 1,700 billionaires who have left South Africa in 2023. And then there are problems with ESCOM. There's fluctuation in electricity. There's a part of what is affecting ArcelorMittal to the tune that ArcelorMittal wants to quit South Africa. That would cost 3,500 direct and indirect jobs, or even as much as 200 and something thousand jobs that actually connected to ArcelorMittal. So if this kind of environment would now be the environment where the multinationals would now need to now increase, especially if they've been paying less than 15%, will now increase to 15%. It's really, really easy to see probably the kind of choices they want to make. They might want to go to a country where there's much more stable electricity, where there's much more, workable business environment in that, and then be able to now afford that 15%, because South Africa, especially as Rob Hersov argues, is already so difficult to conduct business in South Africa. And now this 8 billion that, like you could hear now, the 8 billion is likely to be generated from this increase in 15% according to SARS. Many South Africans are really wondering, where would this 8 billion go? Are we going to be seeing much more of this investment, in the production of jobs? Will these companies, for example, be able to stay to really provide the jobs we need? Or where is this whole 8 billion going to go to? Let's quickly listen to this Professor Tinkle. Her name is actually Professor Tinkle here. She's a professor, Deborah Tinkle. She's a professor of UCT, right? I think this is University of Cape Town. Really break down the ramifications of this whole issue with the increase of 15%. And share your thoughts. What do you think about the ramifications of this whole thing on South Africa and South Africans? Share your thoughts in the comments.
There has been a global movement called the Base Erosion Profit Shifting Action Plan. And this is one of the culminating parts of that action plan. And as you said earlier, what it does is it ensures that global multinational groups will pay globally a minimum of 15% on their income. So what we've done here in South Africa is we've adopted it with effect from 1 January 2024. So it's already in. And what the multinational groups must do is establish what the tax rate is in South Africa, but also if the head office or the head company is in South Africa, in the countries in which they operate. And if that tax rate is lower than 15% on the taxable income, or the gross income, the taxable income, then after some deductions which take into account certain activities, then an additional amount of 15% is paid. And that 15% is either paid by the ultimate parent entity, of which I understand there are around 44 of those types of global companies in South Africa, or alternatively, and what we've done here and many countries are doing in order not to lose the tax, is to say that we will make sure that companies that are members of global entities are paying that 15% within our country if they are operating in our country and paying less than the 15%.
And what industries, Prof, or sectors are likely to be most affected here? And in terms of compliance, what is the requirement for these companies to at least meet then the 15% minimum tax requirement?
Okay, so, I mean, it seems bizarre that would even apply in South Africa since our tax rate here is 27%.
Yeah.
So you'd think we wouldn't have anybody needing to pay it from the point of view of the domestic companies. But there are a lot of multinational entities that are structured such that they have companies and operations in countries where the rate is lower than 15% and quite a lot lower, or they're subject to certain incentives. So it'll be those kind of multinational businesses, so the very, very large corporates that, I mean, if we take an example globally, one could give an example of Apple, which we know has been paying a lot less than an effective rate of 15% for many years, and so have a number of its peers. So it would be those kind of companies that will suddenly find themselves paying more tax than they used to.
And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I think I heard you saying that this applies, obviously, to, companies that have headquarters in South Africa, or does it affect all foreign-based companies operating in the country?
Yes, you're quite right. It's companies that have their headquarters here, where we will look outwards. So we will be looking at the companies that local headquartered companies own and see what they're paying. And then other companies that have subsidiaries in our country, if those subsidiaries collectively are paying less than 15% tax, then they will be subject to the 15% here. And this is where the 8 billion that has been mentioned by Treasury is supposed to be coming from.
Yeah. What are the positive implications in the expectant revenue? Because we did report that is expected around about an additional 8 billion rand in revenue by 2026, 2027.
Well, yes, that's the point, is you'll have, if you're looking at local subsidiaries of companies, what you'll find is that we've got companies that have incentives. So when you have a look at their effective tax rates, and again, we have to remember that this is a very small group or a small body of multinational groups, that we're told by the OECD that around 80% of global revenue is generated by 20% of the companies in the world. So we're looking at a small group. It's a very easy group to monitor. They're very well organized. And so their tax departments have organized themselves to be able to pay these taxes. And the idea is that we will obviously benefit along with other countries where lower taxes are being paid.
Yeah, so it is a manageable group then, as you say. What penalties or consequences will these companies face should they fail to comply?
Okay, well, I mean, the normal penalties that any one of us as taxpayers in South Africa would pay if there is an underpayment, and the underpayment is of, for example, provisional tax by these companies in South Africa, then what will happen is they will be subject to additional taxes for underpaid provisional taxes. And if they are found to have not paid at a later stage, then there could be up to 200% penalties. But as I say, these groups tend to be very well organized. They've been planning for this for some time, and I would suggest are likely to be very organized and able to pay the taxes when they become due.
Yeah. And just finally, Prof, how does South Africa's implementation of this global minimum tax compare to other countries? What's happening elsewhere in the world?
Okay, so there was some criticism actually, because we seem to be always at the forefront, as with many of the OECD suggestions, we're very much at the forefront of implementation. We implemented transfer pricing very early. We've implemented control foreign company rules very early, and these are international tax concepts. We're with this one, the multilateral instrument, we also signed up very early, although that came in a lot later. So we were one of the first, along with Canada and Australia, who implemented with effect from 1 January 2024, but there are very many countries. There are 145 countries that have signed up so far to what they call the inclusive framework. So it's this amazing situation where you've actually got all these countries acting in sync to agree to apply certain taxes. And these 145 countries are not all signed up for the what they call Pillar 2 or Globe, which is this minimum tax yet. But there are very many that already have, and there are very many that will very soon do so. So yeah, we're ahead of the curve in some respects.
All right, Prof, thank you so much for unpacking that for us.